So here we go again, WCA, Mike Amori. Welcome to the Week 5 update. I'm going to show you little snippets from your games. I love the word snippet. Cool word, right? Snippet. Little clips from your games. And in the blog, I'm going to write some important concepts down, some important ideas. Please watch the videos. Please read what I write, because in the back of your mind, you will be planting lots of wonderful chess information. Okay, let's start with a little capturing lesson. This is something that came up in several games this week. Let me show you what I mean. If you take a typical position like e4, e5, knight f3, knight c6, let's look at the Ruy Lopez for a minute, and pawn a6 when black attacks the bishop on b5. Let me flip the board like magic, and very often in this position, white decides to give up the bishop for the knight. And their idea is to damage the black pawn structure. At the beginner level, kids with the white pieces think they can take the knight here on c6 so that they can snap off the pawn on e5. But that trick is not going to work, because here the more common way to take back is with the d pawn. Now, let's put it back for a minute. As you're learning chess, you hear so often to take towards the center with pawns. But in this particular case, because it's the opening, you take away from the center. Because why? Let's put the highlights on. You see the activity of the queen and the bishop. What are you trying to accomplish in the opening? You're trying to develop pieces. That's why you're taking away from the center. And when you have this pawn structure with 4 pawns on one side of the board, very often that's a good place to park your king. So let's look at, oh, by the way, in case they try to steal the pawn, you should all know the move queen to d4, which hits the e-pawn and the knight at the same time, and black will get the pawn back with a very comfortable game. Okay, let's look at another. Let's go back to e4, and now let's look at the Sicilian defense. I will flip the board again. This line has been played in the World Championship that's currently going on between Magnus Carlsen and Fabiano Caruana. Bishop to b5, pawn to g6, and white again gives up the bishop on the same exact square. Here, you can take back with either pawn, but the way they played in the World Championship is they took with a d-pawn, or Carlsen did this with the d-pawn, and again, look at the lines that open up. Okay, it's a very, very common idea in the opening. Does that mean you always do that? Of course not. You have to think for yourself. Let me show you one more. e4, e5. Let's look at the Russian defense, or the Petrov. That's not it. I'm so sorry. That's it, which is basically a counterattack. Black is telling white, if you take me, I might take you someday. So white takes, and before taking back, black kicks the knight away. It comes home, and black gets the pawn back. One very common move that's become quite popular in this position is the move knight to c3. That's right, see, I said it, c3. You know where that comes from. If the knight takes, look at this, the same exact idea. White will take away from the center. And this is the main line of this opening from here. Just get an idea of how the pieces develop. And like I told you before, you will very often see the white king castle into the 4 pawns. So you have an extra pawn to protect. Queen d7 is a common move. And by the way, you know, maybe we can save this for another time. Can black snap that pawn down here? Or will it get mouse trapped? And if it does get trapped, can you try to free the mouse? Yeah, this is actually a pretty cool line. Maybe someday we'll look at that. All right. Let's take a look at how this happened in class. So here is a position between Daniel A and Sophie. And here Daniel kicked the black bishop and Sophie decided to take. So again, here in this position, white might get a little bit more out of taking with the d-pawn, opening up the queen and the bishop. It's exactly what we saw. But Daniel ended up taking here, and then Sophie was able to break in the middle. They had a really, really cool game. As a matter of fact, I want to jump ahead to show you another theme in this game, which is the right time to strike. Let me see if I can show you that position. Yeah, it's right here. Okay, this is from the same game, and really, really fun, interesting game they played. So if you look here, black has an extra pawn, Sophie does anyway, but she's in a little bit of trouble here because of the fact that the pawns are broken around the black king. As a matter of fact, they somehow got to a point later in this game where Sophie had 4 isolated pawns. But the cool thing about this position is, because there's so many isolated pawns and open lines, the question you have to ask yourself is, what kind of pieces are left on the board? Well, there's a rook and a queen for each side. Can those pieces use open files? Clearly, yes. Aha. Now, Sophie's in a little bit of trouble here, but she's fighting back by attacking the rook down here on e1. And not to blame him, Daniel just says, well, I'm going to protect my my rook, and they finished a very interesting game. But I think he missed a win here. Can you guys spot it? And it's all based on the fact that this queen up here on f6 is so powerful, and the fact that the king is so exposed. But the only hint I can give you is it's very hard to checkmate the king with one piece. So pause your video, and what could white play to give Sophie a headache? Besides her brother Luca, who always gives her a headache. That's right, rook e3. Very, very strong move. Threatening rook to g3, which is strong. You can try to check the king. You know, checks get us in and out of trouble a lot. But once the king hides, you do have another check, but that's answered by a check. Cool, right? A check answered by a check. And, you know, you can play king f8, but then Sophie loses the rook in the corner. Do you see how? Give a little check, king moves, and off comes the rook. And it's very fortunate that this rook covers the white king from any check. And by the time you try to take advantage of that pin by moving the h-pawn, white will get out of this. You know, you can always move the king somehow, block the check, and white's doing really well here. Okay, let's look at a game that I was actually playing against Navaneeth with the, I had the black pieces, and here, if I flip the board, he played really, really well. I mean, this is a really nice tight game, came from a center counter defense, but the theme here I want you to be careful about is changing the pawn structure. And what he did here is he played a pawn break. And right now in this position, white only has one break. Can you spot black's break? Yeah, if black wanted to break, oh my goodness, I forgot. What is the definition of a pawn break? For those of you who don't know, well, all of you know, of course. Ask your teachers in school this question when you go into school next week. You know, hey, what's a pawn break? If they don't know, because your teachers will ask you questions. You know, what's the Pythagorean theorem? And a squared plus. So if they ask you questions, you ask the teacher back a question. Say, hey, what's a pawn break? Now, don't do that. You'll get in trouble. What is a pawn break? Simple. 2 pawns are bumping heads. You attack the pawn from the side to open up lines. Pretty simple concept. Black has a pawn break, but there's no way I'm playing it because like Navaneeth has 800 pieces guarding the e5 square. You see that? Black's not playing e5 anytime soon. But what he did is he played c4. And by changing the pawn structure now, it gave black a little bit of play. Because when I take his pawn and he takes with the queen, I hit him with rook c8. And white is clearly not lost. But the only thing, I think he went to d3, and then I hop my knight into b6. Do you see why? The idea is to take advantage of the d5 square. When he changed the pawn structure before c4, we had this position, correct? You see how everything is kind of uniform here and the center is semi-closed? When he breaks and everything comes off the board the way I showed you, there's a nice outpost square on d5. Well, technically not an outpost square because it's not on his side of the board, but you can see after a couple of moves, he played really well. I offered a queen trade, hoping he'll, take my queen. I can just hop my knight into d5, but he played a cool move. He played a4, and then we had a little fight over here. I hopped the knight in, and he moved his bishop out of the way, and I played an ugly move. I played rook a8. It is a move that I do not want to play because my rook is now babysitting the pawn. But the problem for white is they have to deal with the double attack on the b pawn, and black is, a little bit better here because of the structure. Is that okay with everyone? Here it is. If you're going to change the pawn structure, try to imagine what it's going to look like before all the trades happen. Very good. Okay, from another center counter defense. This is Leah playing black against Danny B with white. And here, after Danny Castle, Leah missed a chance to really just crunch the white position. Can I say that? Crunch it? Remember Captain Crunch? Is that still around? I used to eat that cereal as a kid. And you used to have the toys at the bottom. You put your hand all the way in. My mother would yell, wash your hands, and blah, blah. Okay, Mom, sorry. Just take the pawn, Leah. And Danny's in big, big, big trouble because this incredible pin on this line, you snap off the pawn, and your king is safe. The rook is lining up with the queen. You have to be really careful. If you play some move like bishop e2 to break the pin, then you lose the queen to knight f3 check. And then goodbye, queen. You guys see that? So Leah, Miss Leah, I think in the game you played... so here it is. She should play knight takes d4. So she played e6, developing a piece. But again, the timing of your strikes. Sometimes you have to strike before you develop. You see how hard chess is? Sometimes you move a piece twice and you go, wait, last week you told me don't move the same piece twice. Now this week I'm telling you, strike before developing another piece. That's right. It's hard, but chess is supposed to be hard. Okay, you guys got it? You have to time your strikes. So here is Kavya with white playing the famous Luca. He's become one of the most famous students at the WCA. With a capture coming. There's a capture, b takes b6. So now we're talking about recapturing. In this position, this is like an opening or more of a middle game. You guys see the concept here? So Luca would have the chance to take with the C or A pawn. So what do you think he did here? Is there a difference? Yeah, he took with the A pawn, and he made this really cool compact structure here with a whole bunch of pawns. So when Kavya makes that trade, she should ask herself, did the trade help black or help white? But I really want you to pay attention to the way he took back, activating the rook, okay? So again, all these principles and ideas are coming from your games. I'm very, very pleased with everybody's work this term. Okay, let's look at this one. Talk about timing your strikes. This was James R. playing the white pieces against Arjun. And James R., this is not the exact position because James got a winning position a little bit earlier. And we were kind of messing around with the position just to see if there were ways for black to defend. And this was one position that we came up with. But James built a beautiful attack with the bishop and queen. Clearly, the queen wants to come into this square and checkmate on g7. And again, this is not the exact move order, but I'm using this position that we analyzed just to give you an idea of things that can happen. I think at one point, Arjun went for more material, and then James just put his pawn here on e5, supporting the bishop, because once the bishop is supported, then the queen can try to come in and deliver mate. But keep in mind, sometimes you can even sacrifice the queen to avoid the mate. But in this case, if you sacrifice the queen, it's going to get replaced with the pawn, and then you'll have like a pawn wedge on the 6th rank near the enemy king. Ah, that one again, huh? Oh, goodness. Sorry about that. Didn't want to do that. So here, after the move e5, if you bring the knight out, that's what happened. It's pretty much what happened in the game. And then after, queen h6, mate was pretty much impossible to stop, and the game ended. But I'm just curious, if you guys had this position, knight to d3, would you be able to stop the checkmate here? Any way to do that? So if you go back here, instead of moving your knight out, what about pawn h5? Which is a pretty cool idea. It just shuts the queen down. But of course, you know what James would do. He's going to come right in anyway. Now what do? Pause your video. You can actually play king h7, and you might survive to tell a story here. Your rook can come here and cover g8 if it needs to. And white in order to checkmate black, is going to have to somehow break these pawns down. Remember, in order to do that, you have to avoid queen trades, and if you push the pawns in front of your own king, you might be opening up the game. Also, keep in mind that black has extra material, so in case it gets too hot, he might be able to get out of trouble. Okay, I'm going to leave it at that because there's like a lot of material there. Please, after watching the video, look in the blog to the concepts that I wrote for you and try to apply them in your own games going forward, okay? You guys are doing a wonderful job. And those who know me know two things about me. One, I'm a big New York Met fan. And two, I never give false compliments. Have a nice week, everyone.